has been active in advocating for our forest protection for the last 20 years, and she recently became the youngest recipient ever of the Jess Beckerling Award in 2015, which is dedicated for a lifelong dedication for protecting nature. So without further ado, please welcome Jess.
Studies, so I'm going to rely on my notes a little bit. I'm going to focus on the impacts of logging on wildlife and biodiversity in the southwest forests, and talk about particular forests where I've really had the practical side of my education in why we need strong biodiversity laws over the past few years. I was lucky to have the theoretical side of my education in this from John at Murdoch a couple of years ago. So it's tricky to condense all of that into a 10-minute time frame. So I'm just going to go through a series of examples of different forests that I've experienced this need for new laws in so significantly. And just a very quick little bit of context. So we all know that we're in a global biodiversity hotspot, but a lot of people don't really know what that means. There's 36 altogether recognised biodiversity hotspots. One was just added this year. The southwest is one of those. They cover only 2.3% of the Earth's surface, but they're the sort of seed banks of terrestrial life. And from a human need perspective, they account for as much as 35% of all of the ecosystem services that we rely on. So things like oxygen in the air, water purification. But to be classified as a global biodiversity hotspot, you mustn't only be incredibly diverse in life that's found nowhere else on Earth, but you also have to be under enormous threat. And that's measured by the amount of natural vegetation that's been cleared or severely degraded. So all of these areas are wonderfully rich in unique life, but they've also lost as much as 70% of their natural vegetation, which is making their biodiversity obviously very vulnerable. And in the southwest, we've lost more than 80% of our natural vegetation. So I'm going to do what people often do, much to the intense frustration of entomologists and mollusk enthusiasts, I'm sure, and talk about cockatoos and numbats and possums. So before I do, I'm going to pay my respects to all of the other land fauna. And you can see that mammals and birds make up just over 1% of all the terrestrial fauna in WA. So, while we're talking about all of these species that often attract the attention that's necessary for biodiversity conservation, it's important that we remember that when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about the full suite of all of the plants and animals. The plants aren't even on there, I apologise, that make up a healthy ecosystem. So, first example, this is Cheney Barrett Forest. It's a carry forest between Vancouver and Kempston. It's a beautiful old forest that's known to be habitat for a number of threatened species. While we were there, we heard red tailed black cockatoos and carnabies, and later I found out that it's also known to be habitat for the critically endangered western red tailed possum. In the 1930s, perhaps due to its proximity to Manjimup and Pemberton, a lot of Cheney Barrett was lightly logged, leaving behind a few big old stumps, and some areas dominated by regrowth and other areas of old growth. But because the government's definition of old growth requires that a carry forest is totally uncut, even one stump in a hectare disqualifies it from the definition. So in 2001, when the old growth was officially protected, because it had a couple of stumps in it, it wasn't defined as old growth and wasn't protected. So, so I think this really goes to the heart of why we need robust biodiversity conservation laws as a part of an integrated system for protecting biodiversity. We need a reserve system from which threatening processes like logging and clearing and inappropriate burning are excluded. And of course this reserve system needs to be large enough, it needs to be intelligently designed, it needs to be connected, it needs to be in the right places. But try as we might, we can't get everything that needs to be in the reserve system into the reserve system. And quite often we can't exclude all of the threatening processes, even from within the reserve system. So outside of the reserve system where threatening processes are occurring, we need strong laws that prevent, for example, the timber industry from being able to make really catastrophic impacts on the biodiversity and the individual wildlife species that are in there. And of course such laws must be able to transcend the politics of the day. You know, as John was saying, there's just far too much discretion given to the minister to be able to decide when and where to protect species. That's completely unacceptable. And of course it must be applicable to land and to waters. So when the Quinnanup locals who first found this forest scrub boulder marked out for logging phoned me and we walked through, we looked for ways that we might be able to protect what we could, or at least document what was going on. And what we found was that, as usual, the skinniest carry trees with no hollows were marked for habitat retention, and everything else was soon to go. And then many of them, as is also the case, were unhealthy and sometimes suppressed trees that are unlikely to ever be able to make prime habitat. And the ancient strong old trees, already with a complex large canopy offering plenty of food and hollows for nesting, weren't marked for habitat retention and would soon be chopped down and usually go for woodchips. So this was one of the emails from one of the Forest Products Commission representatives telling me that even old trees with obvious nesting hollows would be destroyed. He used the charming word release during the clear cutting. I couldn't actually believe that he was using the word release. It sort of sounded evangelical, and so I wrote back to him and asked him what that word meant in that context, and he confirmed that you know it actually was just going to be chopped down for trees. So the fundamental question, and one that the Quinnanup locals who found this area asked is, well, how can they get away with cutting down hollows, obvious hollows that you can see from the ground when you're marking out the forest, which ones are you going to retain, which ones are you going to chop down? How can they get away with chopping down 500-year-old carry trees with an obvious nesting hollow in them, when we know that nesting hollows are the limiting factor that's causing the decline of so many species? And you know, what if there were birds using? What if there were mammals or birds using that hollow at the time? And Natalie was saying to me there could even be a baby cockatoo in there. And the answer is that there's no laws to prevent them from doing that, and that's going back to the old 1950 Wildlife Conservation Act, and it's maintained in the new Biodiversity Conservation Bill before Parliament. So the only way to stop them, and I'll get back to this later, is to climb that tree yourself. So what about when they're critically endangered? And who decides if they are critically endangered? Western ringtail possums are unique to the southwest, and they've suffered an 80% decline in their overall population in the last 10 years. And given clearing and logging practices and their vulnerability to being eaten by foxes and cats, that's anticipated to get worse over the next decade. So in 2012, the experts found that they are critically endangered, and they face an extremely high prospect of extinction in the wild. So surely their habitat would be protected under this new legislation. Well, in December 2014, the State Environment Minister did increase their official level of threat on the back of that advice, but not to critically endangered, as the scientists have recommended, but only to endangered, because that was his call to make. So that goes to John's point about needing to see the minister being required to provide evidence about why he or she has differed from the scientific information. I mean, I would go one step further and say that the information should be, the listing should be based on the scientist's advice, not on the advice of a minister who next week might be the Minister for Mines and Petroleum. It would continue to give the minister that discretion. And even if the minister had listed the Western ringtail as critically endangered, it's my understanding, John, correct me if I'm wrong, but the law still wouldn't require the habitat for that species to be protected. It would still be the discretion of the minister. And then, as the God clause goes, what happens to that species, including it being monitored to an expected extinction, remains the discretion of the minister. So that's just kind of madness to me, and it has no place in a law that we've waited 66 years for. So on the other side of the hill, that's what Channing Barrett looked like, and there's a habitat tree over there on the far left. At the front of the shop, on the left-hand side. So you can imagine, Western ringtail possum or a cockatoo or any other species that you like, trying to find food and shelter in that forest. And that's why repeatedly, when we're in the forest, it gets to the point where the only thing that you can think is that we need stronger laws because, you know, there's not enough people standing in front of bulldozers to change policy fast enough, I suppose. So now this is Nelson Forest in Bridgetown, and I thought it was probably a good idea to show you a pretty picture at this point, give some heartening news, but I never saw Nelson before it was Clearfield, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I just, here's a picture of my daughter with a rainbow umbrella, this is the best that I can do. And it was here in Nelson that we found perfect nesting hollows from ancient trees piled up in the burnt holes.
Yeah.
You know, they're obvious nesting hollows, you could have seen them from the ground, but then they are ready to be burned. This is a smokestack hollow, so when the crown has fallen off the top of a carry tree and left a hollow going down into the trunk of the tree, it's a favourite hollow for the cockatoos, and there it is ready to be burnt. And then there's a much smaller one in the background on the right, bottom right hand side of the screen, forming all just there ready to be burnt. And it was also in Nelson that we found ancient marri trees that had been destroyed and just left to rot or burn. We sent a sample from the stump of this tree to be dated, and we found it was around 400 years old. So these ancient marri trees, you know, that it's very common to find this sort of thing. And over the last, since 67, there's been more than 12 million cubic metres of marri wood chipped. So, you know, they're a fundamental species in the ecology, healthy ecology of the southwest forests. They're so important to so many different species. And, you know, although we know that their scarcity and ongoing loss is the major driver for the likely extinction of Borden's cockatoos, which are only down in the southwest corner, they're still being chopped down and left to burn in the post-Clearfield burns. And then there's this guy. So numbats are our state faunal emblem. There are fewer than 1,000 of them left in the wild. And they used to live right across the southern half of the country. They went right over to the western side of New South Wales, right through South Australia. They went up to the border of the Northern Territory in South Australia, and were right through the southwest. But now there's only 2 remaining populations, original populations. They've been reintroduced into a couple of places, but original populations at Dryandra and one just in the Act4Nature Reserve east of Manjimup. So they're in a pretty bad way. Fewer than 1,000 of them, their genetic diversity is getting pretty low, things aren't looking great for them. So when this guy was photographed at the entrance to its hollow where it may have had babies waiting during a logging operation in Warwick Forest in 2011, we all assumed that we would be able to stop or at least alter the logging. And I think it was at this point that I lost my hope that we would be able to find, with the right lawyers, a legal argument with our existing laws, because we still weren't able to do anything for them. And so that really said to me that we need new laws, and not just for the forests either, as the other guys will speak about, but for all the other ecosystems in WA as well. So finally, Helms. Helms is the release site for rehabilitated and captive bred black cockatoos. The Pattersons have been breeding and rehabilitating injured birds and releasing them into Helms in conjunction with Deeport for more than 20 years from Jamari. In spite of it being internationally recognised as an important bird area for the known breeding pheasant Bordens, a part of it was listed for logging in 2012 and eventually logged against the fierce community opposition in 2014 and 15. And here are some of the people who were arrested and charged. Somebody over here tonight, and ordered to pay substantial fines and legal costs and even compensation to the timber industry during the Helms campaign. This is Dee. Dee Patterson has been the manager or co-manager for many years of Jamari, caring for endangered black cockatoos since the early 1990s. And eventually, after exhausting all avenues for protecting Helms from logging, from 1991 she started trying. She lay down in a car dragon and trained herself into the road in January last year, I think, to stop the machinery and tree fallers from being able to access the forest. And she had to pay more than $5,000 in legal costs and fines as a result. So why am I ending on the blockaders, other than that I hold them in such high esteem? It's because rather than introducing laws to protect biodiversity, proper laws that will actually protect biodiversity, the Barnett government has introduced laws to jail people for up to 2 years for the exact things that these people did to try to protect homes and many other places, not just forests again. And the reason they're defending homes with their bodies is because no legal avenues exist to protect threatened species and their habitats. And that to me is just absurd. So I want to see the government drop the protest bill before it's passed into law and instead revisit the Biodiversity Conservation Bill in consultation with scientists and environmentalists and the broader community so that it is actually able to protect WA's unique and spectacular wildlife and biodiversity.